St. Paul wrote 2 letters to Timothy. He was a man who was ordained by St. Paul himself, so he sees him as himself as a spiritual father to Timothy. And at the end of his second letter to Timothy, he's kind of giving Timothy some instructions, and he's asking him to help him out. And he says, when you come, please bring the cloak that I left, and also the books, and above all, the parchments. He's asking for just some things to be delivered by him. It seems like a small little business item, but I find it interesting. So he's referring to, a piece of clothing, the parchments, referring to perhaps the things that he's been writing, these letters that will eventually become the scriptures for us. Could have been maybe passages from the Old Testament that he had. But I love that little reference to books. He wants his books. He wants to read. He wants to form his soul. Paul recognized that he needed to continue to grow. He needed to grow even intellectually. And so he looked forward to having his books again so that he can continue to read and grow in that way. As Christians, Jesus calls us to love the Lord with our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And I think we're really good at remembering a couple of those. We especially remember we're supposed to love the Lord with our whole heart. But sometimes we forget we're supposed to love the Lord with our mind. We're supposed to choose to keep learning, give the Lord our intellect, continue forming our mind. It's really important that we continue to form our minds for a few reasons. First of all, it's going to be really helpful for us as people question us about our faith. We'll be more ready to give a reason for our faith. We'll be able to explain things better, especially in a world full of skepticism. This would be perfect. So it will allow us to be more compelling witnesses to Jesus as we're able to explain things to people better, perhaps because of things that we've read. It will also help to strengthen our own convictions as Christians, and it would be especially helpful for us in prayer. Honestly, the more that we understand about God, the more that we're able to know that we're encountering the true God. The more that we learn about him, the more that we're immersed in the truth of who God is, then we know that when we come to the Lord, we don't have any misguided ideas of who Jesus is, who God the Father is. Like, we have come to know him in our minds, and now we can come to know him in our hearts because we're not looking after some false version of God. My own experience is that reading has been really important in my own journey as a Christian. When I was my freshman year of college, I was getting hit with all sorts of questions about my faith, and so I realized that I needed to figure out what I believe. So in that first year of college, I really committed myself to learning. So I read the Bible in that 1 year, the whole thing. I read the entire catechism in that 1 year, and I started to dive in to just understanding things. I dove into something called apologetics, just learning how to defend our faith. And the more that I read, the more that I was convinced in my mind, and honestly, it made me more and more in love with the Lord. It helped me to love the Lord with my whole heart because I was learning how to love him with my whole mind. And even as I grew through seminary, I was exposed to all sorts of great things. I was exposed to some great spiritual classics by some different saints who reflected on the spiritual life. I learned theology. I came across some really great Catholic literature, even some really fun Catholic literature. And so what I would like to do now is share with you some of my book recommendations. In this quarantine, I don't have access to a whole ton of books. I can't go to the library and show you all the books that I wish I could have you read, but I'm going to show you some of the books in my own personal collection and give you some recommendations of some things that I have enjoyed reading, and I think that you would also enjoy reading. So I'm going to take you to my bookshelf, and I'll show you some of the things that are on there, and I'll break it down to a few different categories to give you some ideas of some good things to read. This is my shelf of spiritual reading books. So I want to make a few recommendations from the books I have here on the shelf. This is The Strangest Way, Walking the Christian Path by Bishop Robert Barron. It was written by him when he was just Father Robert Barron. It's a really beautiful reflection on what makes the Christian life unique and how can we live that out through prayer, through our way of life. Really a fantastic introduction to really a Christian understanding of the spiritual life. This little one next to it is He Leadeth Me by Father Walter Ciszek. He was a Jesuit priest who was arrested during World War II by the Soviets, and he was convicted
of being a Vatican spy. That was not the case at all. But he spent a very long time in Soviet prisons and labor camps. So this book is his reflection on where God was in the midst of all that. How did he encounter the Lord and his providence and his goodness and his love, even though he was suffering so much? This little book over here is When God is Silent by Bishop Luis Martinez. Finding spiritual peace amid the storms of life. It's a great reflection on how do we experience God when life is difficult, in moments of suffering, in those times when in prayer it feels like God just isn't talking. My prayer life is really difficult right now. This is a fantastic reflection on how do we find God in the midst of those times. Introduction to the Devout Life. This is a classic by St. Francis de Sales. He wrote this for the ordinary person. He wrote this for the working person, for the married person. We're not all called to have the spiritual life of a monk or a nun. We're called to experience the Lord and find the Lord and have a regular routine of prayer in the midst of having a regular life with a family and with a job. And so this is really a fantastic book on how to discover God in the midst of everything. And it's really intended for everybody. And the Story of a Soul, there's several editions of Story of a Soul. This is just one publishing that I have of it, but it is St. Therese of Lisieux's spiritual autobiography, as she tells her own story of where God has been in the course of her life, how she's come to encounter the Lord and his love and his gentleness with her. If you're into biographies, then I've got a couple of options, suggestions over here. St. Joan of Arc. There's a book by Mark Twain, of all people, on Joan of Arc. Mark Twain was fascinated, absolutely fascinated with Joan of Arc. And he really wanted people to know her because he was just a huge admirer of this woman of character, this woman of strong convictions. So he actually published it under a different name because he knew that when people thought of the name Mark Twain, they thought of funny stories and goofiness. And so he wanted to be taken seriously. So he wrote this book under a different name, but eventually we've published it under his name, Mark Twain, even though even Mark Twain's not his real name. Edmund Campion, A Life. This is by Evelyn Waugh. This is the story of a priest who experienced great persecution in the midst of the Protestant Reformation in England. He was tracked down. He spent a lot of time in hiding, trying to spread the gospel, trying to bring the sacraments to people, and eventually gave his life for Christ and life for the church. Really an inspiring read by Evelyn Waugh. And then St. Francis of Assisi by G.K. Chesterton. There's a lot of biographies out there about St. Francis. This happens to be my favorite. I think that Chesterton brings a freshness and a lightness, I guess you could say, to the life of a man who's already so fascinating. If you're looking for just some fun reading, I've got a great recommendations up here. Obviously, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and then this also has The Hobbit in here. The stories are written by an incredibly devout Catholic, J.R.R. Tolkien, and there's so much richness to these stories with the themes. The characters in the stories very often teach us about Christ, and it's a great reflection on humanity and on salvation. The Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. It's a slightly entertaining story of this older demon trying to mentor this younger one on how do you catch humans and get them to fall into sin and get them to reject God. It really makes for a really great examination of our own conscience and the ways in which we've fallen into the evil one's traps. Michael O'Brien has written a number of beautiful books. My favorite is Father Elijah and Apocalypse. Obviously a thick book. You're going to need some time, but when you're in quarantine, you got some time probably. It is a book about a priest who's called upon to try to convert a man who is arising in the world who appears to be an antichrist figure. It's clearly written by a man who prays and a man who knows the spiritual life and knows how to draw us into a deeper examination and deeper encounter with the Lord. And finally, if you're just looking for some fun, the Father Brown Mysteries, there's a number of them by G.K. Chesterton. Being a priest who's solving these mysteries, who's the main hero of these stories, he knows people. He knows their hearts. And so his mysteries also become, rather than just being about clues like you might find in a Sherlock Holmes story, it's also about understanding the human person and coming to know a person's heart. Because if you can understand their heart, then you can understand why they committed the crime they did.
So I hope you've enjoyed this little tour of some good books that I think are really worth reading and are really good for the forming of our mind. And then that helps to form us in our heart and even to form us in our prayers. Paul knew that he needed continued growth, and we all need continued growth in order to love the Lord with our whole heart, soul, mind, and strength. God bless you.